So in the measure that Luther and his colleagues re-emphasized, brought right to the fore, this issue of the primacy of grace, I say, good.
Hello everyone, I'm Joseph Dinesh, a Catholic commentator from Sydney, Australia. In today's video, we are diving into some jaw-dropping claims made by Protestants here in Australia about the Catholic Church, and trust me, you're in for a ride. Before we jump into the details, let me set the stage. Over the years, I have noticed a recurring pattern. Protestants who hate the Catholic Church typically fall into one of these three categories, and it's almost too predictable. First, we have the parrots. These are folks who have absolutely no idea what the church actually teaches. They simply repeat whatever their pastors have told them like a broken record without pausing to fact check or think critically. Then there is the agenda-driven crowd. These individuals aren't concerned with seeking the truth at all. Their mission is clear: to drag the church's name through the mud. They will twist facts, spread hate, and say whatever it takes to rile up people. Finally, we have the deliberate twisters. These are the most cunning of the bunch. They know exactly what the Catholic Church teaches, but intentionally misrepresent to gain favor within their congregation and their sphere of influence. Now, given that background, let's take a look at a clip of some Australian Protestants criticizing the Catholic Church. Pay close attention as you watch and see if you can figure out which category their arguments fall into. Let's watch.
I remember being horrified. I read through all the readings on a Sunday in the Roman Catholic lectionary for, I don't know, whether it was year A, B or C in the lectionary cycle, but I could not find grace in the year of readings. And I thought, they have so cherry-picked. It was almost, I don't know how you could pick a year of 52 Old Testament, 52 New Testament, 52 Gospel, and not... Anyway.
Yeah, because the focus is not on grace. The focus is on the church administering you what you need to hear and to know, and so leading you to receiving, the sacramental grace that the church administers, and even the way the arrangement of the readings doesn't seem to be focusing on grace.
Yeah.
If you're wondering what is this all about, it is an age-old debate between Catholics and Protestants on the topic of salvation. Protestants believe in sola gratia, which means salvation is entirely God's work and there is nothing we can do to contribute. Catholics, on the other hand, agree that God's grace is foundational and comes first, but emphasize that humans must cooperate with that grace through faith and good works to complete the process of salvation. So in the clip that you just saw, the criticism is that Catholics don't focus enough on grace and instead place too much emphasis on sacraments and rituals, which they feel is unnecessary. However, what's particularly interesting about this debate is that both Catholics and Protestants agree that salvation begins with God's grace. The real disagreement arises when Protestants insist that it is solely by grace. If that still seems a bit unclear, don't worry. Bishop Barron will explain it beautifully in the following clip.
So first of all, on the positive side, what is the great contribution of Luther and Reformers? I would say this: a renewed emphasis on the principle of the primacy of grace. I think arguably the fundamental biblical principle is the primacy of grace, namely that God's love comes first. God chooses, God gives, God graces, and everything else flows from that. When we forget this principle, and mind you, it has been forgotten a lot over the Christian centuries. Whenever we do that, we get into serious spiritual trouble. Now, to give it a technical name, it becomes Pelagianism, which is a theory. It's grounded in Pelagius, this early patristic figure, of auto-salvation, right? That I can save myself through my heroic efforts. If I'm just morally good enough, I will, as it were, compel God to save me. My moral excellence comes first. Auto-salvation. When we get on that track, what happens? The whole biblical thing, all of Christianity basically falls apart. Because in that case, I don't really need a savior. And Jesus does, in fact, devolve. And you see it a lot over the centuries, including today. Jesus devolves into being a vague religious teacher rather than a savior. So in the measure that Luther and his colleagues re-emphasized, brought right to the fore this issue of the primacy of grace, I say, good. I say yes. The church must always hear that message.
As Bishop Barron points out, Catholics passionately uphold the doctrine of the primacy of grace. This teaching is non-negotiable because rejecting it would lead directly into the trap of Pelagianism, a heresy that falsely claims humans can achieve spiritual greatness or even salvation purely through their own efforts without the power of God's grace. Of course, that's not how grace works, and Catholics are crystal clear on that point. But here's where it gets intriguing. If Catholics agree with much of what Martin Luther and the Protestant reformers emphasized about the centrality of grace, why has this debate raged on for over 500 years? Where does the real conflict lie? That's the mystery Bishop Barron will unpack in the next clip. Let's watch.
So how come you're not a Lutheran, you might say to me? How come you don't just accept the Lutheran critique? How come there isn't a Lutheran order in the Catholic Church as there is a Franciscan and Dominican? Well, I think a lot of it hinges on this little fact. If Luther had stopped at saying gratia prima, I'd be okay, grace first. The trouble was, he pushed it and said gratia sola, by grace alone. And that's where the Catholic Church, relying on its ancient tradition and its roots very much in the Bible and the Church Fathers, balked and said, no, that's too strong. At the same time, Trent insists that cooperation with grace is ingredient in the process of salvation. They speak of justification, whereby God reaches out to us, and then an increase in justification, whereby we cooperate with the grace of God.
Now let's clarify this with an analogy to make things crystal clear. Imagine you're a student on the verge of failing an exam. You're completely overwhelmed, out of your depth, and no amount of effort can pull you out of this hole. Just when all hope seems lost, a brilliant and compassionate teacher steps in to save the day. Now that's the situation. Now if this teacher followed the Protestant doctrine of grace alone, here is how it would go. She takes over everything. She studies for you, completes all your assignments, and even shows up to write the exam in your place. Your role in it? Nothing. So when the results come in and you have aced the classes, you would say, I didn't lift a finger, it was all her work. Sounds appealing, doesn't it? But doesn't it also feel like something is missing? This view might sound generous, but it removes any active role or responsibility from you entirely. That is the Protestant position of sola gratia. Now, if your teacher followed the Catholic understanding of grace and cooperation, things would look a bit different. She would still do everything possible to help you succeed, tutoring you one-on-one, creating personalized practice tests, preparing detailed notes, and regularly checking in to motivate you. But when the exam day arrives, you still have to show up, take the test, and apply everything she's taught you. She won't write the exam for you, but she's set you up for success in every way. When you finally pass, you can proudly say, I did it, but at the same time, my teacher had everything to do with it. It's a partnership. Her expertise and effort made it possible, but your active participation was crucial to the process. This beautifully captures the Catholic teaching on grace and human cooperation. Now, let's tackle the final complaint that Catholics don't preach enough about grace. Can Protestants really make that claim? Honestly, I'm not sure there is any way to statistically prove it. But for the sake of the argument, let's say it is true. Here is the thought. Perhaps Catholic preaching focuses less on grace because grace is the constant. It's always there, always given freely by God. The challenge isn't recognizing grace, it's responding to it. Think about it. As humans, we often struggle with motivation and inspiration to act. That's where Catholic teaching steps in, emphasizing what we must do to cooperate with God's grace, how to live out our faith, follow His will, and strive for virtue. Maybe Catholic preachers don't focus on grace as much because they assume we already know it's there. Instead, they focus on what we need to do next, how to take that grace and transform it into a life of action and holiness. Doesn't that shift the perspective? Finally, I would like to conclude with the profound words of one of the greatest saints in the Catholic Church, St. Augustine. He said, without God, we cannot. Without us, God will not. I hope this video is helpful. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. God bless you.